It's time for the tactics meeting, where we talk about everything emergency response. We have a great show for you today. Cheryl Surface is with us to give expert advice on how to conduct the Command and General Staff meeting. Can we use a single-page ICS 202 objectives form? Do we have to follow the agenda exactly as it's written? Are priorities and objectives redundant? I think they are. What's the answer? Stay tuned, we're going to get into it. This episode of the Tactics Meeting is brought to you by Easy 213. Easily manage resource requests and approvals during an incident or exercise. The Easy 213 application is available for web browsers, iPad OS, iOS, and it's available on the desktop. Manage multiple incidents, unlimited resource requests, digital signature capture, alerts when a new order has been placed. I've used it for 3 exercises and people love it. For more information, go to portagebay.com/easy213. And we thank them and Portage Bay for their support of the tactics meeting. Now let's get to this amazing episode. Cheryl Surface is back with us in our 3rd installment of the journey around the planning P. We've already discussed the initial 201 briefing and the actually, I guess it's the 4th installment, right? We did the 201, we did the initial UC meeting, we talked about the objectives meeting, and today we're going to talk about the Command and General Staff meeting. Cheryl Surface, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dan. I appreciate putting on this series for folks out in the Netherlands, I guess.
We've gotten a lot of good feedback from this series. We'll probably have to lump it all together in one video later on. So today it's the Command and General Staff meeting. I've got my Incident Management Handbook, U.S. Coast Guard, May 2014, open in front of me so that I have the agenda. I just want to start by asking you, in your own view as the planning section chief, what your thoughts are on the purpose or an explanation of the purpose of the Command and General Staff meeting.
Well, the short version of the purpose of the Command and General Staff meeting is, remember when you had the objectives meeting and your unified command set objectives and priorities for the next operational period. Really, the Command and General Staff meeting is their opportunity to now give direction to their Command and General Staff, so to their officers and chiefs. So they've set some objectives, they've set some priorities, they've put together, a to-do list of open actions for their staff. So at the Command and General Staff meeting, you've got your officers and your chiefs and some identified other areas to come in. And your unified command is saying, hey, here's the objectives we've set for the next operational period. And oh, by the way, here's a list of to-do items, an open action tracker that we want to make sure that you guys are able to complete.
So we've got the Command and General Staff meeting on the meeting agenda. Let's say it's going to take place 45 minutes from now. What is the process of preparing? What do you do as the planning section chief to get ready for that meeting?
I usually assign like my deputy planning section chief, situation unit leader, even a documentarian to kind of organize the forms that we need, the tools that we need in order to have the meeting. So they'll be setting up the meeting room, whether it's virtually or whether it's in-person meeting room. So of course, you're going to need a copy of your objectives, your 202, ICS 202, your objectives for the next operational period. You're going to need a copy of that. You're going to need a copy of the open action tracker. So that ICS 233, you're going to need a copy of that. And then you're going to need a copy of your meeting schedule as well, your ICS 230, because you're going to want to make sure that people are on task for when the next meetings are going to occur. I also then go around to the folks in the Command and General Staff, so your officers and your chiefs, and I kind of give them a heads up, particularly if it's an exercise or a drill, or even if it's our first Command and General Staff meeting. I want to get to know them. I want them to know what the expectations are at that meeting. I want them to come in prepared. So I say, hey, you're going to be at the command and general staff meeting. I want you to come prepared with a list of action items that you may be working on already. Because when the command and general staff meeting goes over that open action tracker, you're going to have a little speaking part as well, updating the unified command on where you're at in the response at that point in time.
So do you pass out a copy of the existing open action tracker with?
I don't. I just let them. I could, but I usually don't. I mean, if it's day 2, day 3, week 10, they'll be able to view that open action tracker on the situation status display board. The first one, that's a good idea. I probably should pass out that open action tracker. Then it would give them a heads up on what's coming up at that first command and general staff meeting. And that's a good takeaway. I mean, we always learn every single time from, whether we're at an exercise or whether we're at a real response, tools to take away. And I like that idea of handing them the open action tracker ahead of time and just saying, here's the items that you're going to be, the unified command's going to be asking you about. So come prepared with an update on where you're at. Generally speaking, most people, because they've been working on it, they'll say, I haven't started yet, or here's where I'm at. So, opportunity, whether you do it or not, it probably won't make or break the deal.
I guess it depends a little bit on how you're maintaining it. We maintained it in Excel for a long, long time, and then lately we've been using the task manager in Teams as the open action tracker, and I've never tried to print. I'm assuming there's a way to print it from that, but at least in that way, everybody has got it available to them. It's already there. You just log into Teams, and there's the tracker.
I think it's best for my own self, even on a Teams platform, to continue to use the Excel spreadsheet. You want one keeper of that. And the keeper of that open action tracker document is actually the documentation unit leader. Because you don't want people to come in and say, oh, that's complete, because then you haven't actually given the unified command the information. That open action tracker is a unified command document. They want to know where you're at in the process when they've given you an item to complete. So having just your documentation unit leader in charge of that and not letting people just go in and say, yep, that's done. Oh, yep, that's done, and complete it. They'd have to go through the documentation unit leader in order to do that. So I don't know. I think it's best to keep that in an Excel platform.
So then, from an online perspective, rather than sharing the Excel document for people to see, we should PDF it and just display a read-only version.
Correct. So when anything goes on the sit stat display in the Teams platform, I always ask my documentation unit leader to PDF those forms before they go on the sit stat display. Just like in a real response, if you're the situation unit leader or the documentation unit leader, you do not want people going up to your situation status display and changing the information. You're the only one that can change that information. It's the situation unit leader documentation. Anybody else can't just run up to your sit stat display and start pulling things off and putting new things on or changing information on there. It really has to funnel through the keeper of that info.
I'm making notes. I learned so much from these podcasts myself. That's why I do them.
I mean, I'm laughing because I've been on real responses where the situation unit leader has put down yellow caution tape in front of the situation status display and do not cross kind of thing, just to keep that's the latest, greatest information. And you need one person to be in charge of that.
That's great. Let's take a look at the agenda for the Command and General Staff meeting. To what extent do and of course I'm looking at the version from the Coast Guard's 2014 IMH, but to what extent do we have to follow the order of the agenda exactly? And I ask because when we say safety is number one, I mean, the last one of these meetings that I ran, I moved around. I had, after the planning section chief opened the meeting, I had the safety officer give their update first, rather than the situation unit leader update followed by safety. It just seemed to me that was more appropriate. Is that Was that wrong of me?
Absolutely not. And I do exactly the same thing you do, Dan. I mean, I follow the agenda out of the book, but I have no problem rearranging a few things. And safety is one of them that I always rearrange. When it's shown below situation, I'm like you, I'm like, that doesn't make sense to me. If safety is our number one priority, then I'm going to have safety speak first, and then I'm going to go into the situation briefing secondarily. So I'm with you on that. Of course, with all meetings, you start by setting the tone. So if you're the planning section chief, you have to take command of a meeting. So, and doing that, it's basically, covering the ground rules, no outside conversations, stick to the agenda, turn your devices off, no making copies, no, being on your computer typing things unless you're the documentation. So set the tone. You also want to go around the room and you want to do roll call. And it's really important to do roll call and send around a sign-in sheet, because a year down the line, 2 years down the line, something might come up in regards to what occurred at that particular meeting. And you want to know who was there, because you may need to go back to an individual and say, hey, do you remember this? This was in the meeting notes. You were at the meeting. This is what we think occurred. And they can say, yep, I was at the meeting, and I definitely agree that was something that occurred. So take your time to do those. Plus, you get an idea of who's in the room. If you're the planning section chief, and you identify, and you'll see me, I'm taking notes, names, so I've got, so I like to call on people by their name, so that puts you in charge of the meeting. If you set the tone at that very bringing the meeting to order, and then you review the agenda. And when I review the agenda, I'll say that, I'm going to put safety first. It's our number one objective. It's the thing that we're most concerned about. So safety officer, I'm going to ask you to give a quick safety briefing for the group right now. And that's something that when I go to the safety officer, head of the command and general staff meeting, I will tell them, I want you to give a briefing first. So that if they're reading their little agenda or they're looking at the agenda on the wall, they're like, I wasn't prepared to do that. So give them a little heads up, I want you to do a safety briefing, real quick safety briefing first, and they're like, okay, just what's important, we need people to sign in, whatever's important, PPE requirements, not just we've had no accidents or injuries, really make it what's important to the folks in the field, and what's important to the folks in the command post. And then go into your situation briefing.
Okay. During the protracted Golden Ray response, you had people that were giving a briefing send you a PowerPoint slide in advance of the meetings and put together a single slide deck that ran those situation briefings. Is that something, since we're doing these drills, exercises, even responses in a hybrid way, is that a best practice for you that's ongoing? Was that a one-off? How would you approach giving these briefings now when some of the audience is online?
If you're doing a hybrid, and we were doing a hybrid on the Golden Ray in Georgia, so we had people calling in from all over the world, actually. So our briefings were definitely hybrid. And that's the slide deck is something that I want to go to every single time in a hybrid situation. Or even I've been pushing it in a response, even when people are just in the room, in case somebody needs to call in. They don't have to be there for every briefing. They can call in. And we had folks in operations, they'd give me the slide deck and they were calling in from the field. So they didn't have to physically be in the command post and in the room. They could call into a briefing and give their, voice briefing, but we could see their slide of what was happening in the field operationally. So I don't know. I think it's a great best practice to move forward with, is that slide deck.
So do you think we should have a templated deck for each of these meetings that we then share with whoever happens to be in those positions? If if you're just joining us as the situation unit leader, and I say, hey, I want you to have a slide deck for the meeting coming up in 30 minutes, we don't want them to have to start from scratch, at least headers or something.
I do have a best practices little slide deck. And like if you're the situation unit leader, then, safety would have a little deck that, has the bullets of what they want to hit, written out. And then they would hit accidents or injuries, how many and cumulative. And then your situation leader, of course, would have 3-day forecasted weather, 3-day forecasted ties on a slide. And then they would talk about anything that was up and coming, on the horizon that could actually affect the operations in the field. But just a one slide for situation as well. If you want to do it for a meeting specific, and I always queue up, like my situation unit leader, if we're doing a hybrid, I'm like, here's how I want you to queue up the meeting. I'll have you, and it would be great if it was in a slide deck, because then the next thing you'd queue up would be you'd queue up the objectives. So you'd bring up the 202, and queuing that up would put you right next into the next item on your agenda is that 202. And whether you want to do a 202A and the 202B and then the 202, that's up to you. So the 202A, they start on the agenda with that, but it really is just like priorities, and then it's got some limitations and constraints, like what time do you want the operational period to begin and end? Do you want a 24-hour operational period? Is there adverse things happening that could affect the response? I think, and for me, that can all be combined in one 202 document. I do it in the little part underneath where it says operational period command emphasis. I'll put those things in there, so it keeps it on a one pager, which makes it handier when you're doing the hybrid. People aren't looking for 3 pages of 202. They're looking for 1 page. And then your 202B is your critical information reporting items. And that, same thing. I put it right below the objectives. I'll put the critical information reporting items. It's kind of up to the unified command. If the unified command wants it to be the 3-page 202, totally okay with putting it together as a 3-pager. If they're like me, where they want, less is more kind of thing, a lot of them will say, yeah, I really like to keep it all on 1 page, because then people aren't flipping through out in the field to find information. They can see it on a 1-page document. Like I said, it's a unified command decision, and I'm meeting with the unified command and discussing that with them and going with their recommendation.
So I'm not bound by this Coast Guard 202, 202A, 202B format. So I look at other versions of ICS documents, and I don't see this multiple page objectives format.
It's very unique to the Coast Guard world. So the 3-page ICS objectives format is very unique to the U.S. Coast Guard world. And so, like I said, unified command sits, the U.S. Coast Guard sits in unified command typically if it's an on-water response. And so it's, they're part of that decision whether they want to go with the 3-page format or not.
Now, is this a decision item that I, as the incident commander, might want to add to my initial UC meeting agenda to select the 202 document format so that I can tell the planning section chief, hey, this is what we want to do going forward today?
I think that's a good idea. I mean, typically when I'm the planning section chief, I meet with the incident commander, the responsible party incident commander ahead of time. And I hand them draft documents. So I hand them a draft 202. I hand them a draft open action tracker. And I hand them actually a draft meeting schedule, so that when they're meeting in that initial UC meeting, they've got those documents that they can share with the state on-scene coordinator and the federal on-scene coordinator, tribal, local on-scene coordinators. They can share those 3 documents and say, hey, we've been doing this a long time. We've got these pre-planned objectives, these pre-planned critical information reporting, and also these pre-planned, open action trackers. straight out of the Northwest Area Contingency Plan. You know, their 96-hour response guidelines. I mean, these weren't made up. These have been tried and tested, and you know, there's something that we've utilized for many years. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel. It's there for you. So I usually meet with them ahead. If you're the responsible party incident commander, you can say, hey, you know, we can also do the 3-page one if you'd like to, but you'll notice on this one pager, all those items are hit on this 1-page document. So it's totally up to you guys. You want to put it in 3 pages or have a 1-pager. And, you know, I'll run in it and meet with all 3 of them before they'll have their initial UC meeting, just so I can kind of give them that, set the tone too. You know, it's your decision at your direction. You get to choose.
So back to the agenda, and speaking of the order, so the agenda calls for reviewing priorities, limitations, constraints before objectives, and I've always found this awkward, and so I switch them. I start off with the objectives. I mean, the objectives are what the incident commander, the unified command, have decided are goals going forward, and that just seems like the right place to start. What are your thoughts?
I do exactly the same thing. So I always start with the ICS 202 objectives. If we're going to go into a 202A and a 202B, it just seems like it seems to make more sense. Let's set the objectives, and then you can set your priorities, your limitations and constraints, your critical information reporting items. But the objectives are the key to what the staff needs to accomplish in the next operational period. So they're the most important thing to me. And so I do put those ahead of everything else. And when I utilize that 1-page document, it just flows. You've got your objectives at the top, you've got your critical information reporting items, and then you've got your priorities, your limitations and constraints down in the body of the 1-page document.
Let's talk about UC provides comments, item 4A on the agenda. Another thing that I have found kind of awkward is to be right in the middle of the agenda and stop and ask the unified command to provide comments. So what I have done is talk to the unified command in advance and decided whether they're going to provide comments at the beginning, because it seems to me that either you're going to have them provide comments even before the safety officer speaks, right at the beginning, or hold comments to the end, or both. But I just don't like it in the middle. What are your thoughts?
So there's kind of 2 levels of thought. A lot of times, particularly if it's early in a response or even in an exercise, I will have the unified command do an opening comment, but I will prep them, because it's not like, hey, go team, we're all in this together kind of thing. It really is, we have set some really big objectives, and our expectation is to get through a planning meeting today. And so we're not going to get into the tactics and strategies. We're going to leave that up to you, but we want to make sure that you guys are hitting every objective that's on there, tactical objective that's on there. And just if you have any questions or comments, you need to route anything up to the unified command, please do it through your officer or your chief kind of thing. Set the tone for that we're in charge. You know, we want you to take over, you know, meeting these objectives that we've set, but just not a, you know, great, rah, rah, go team kind of thing. You know, I want them to be in charge. They're in charge of the response. You know, it's not the planning section chief. So that's an opportunity for them to set that tone.
So maybe if you were to rewrite the agenda, the line item would not be provide comments, but provide
Direction.
opening direction.
Opening
Right?
directive. Right.
Right? Because comments makes it sound pretty, you know, a little more rah-rah team, right? And direction is a little more clear.
Right.
Matter of fact, I think I'll make that suggestion to the Coast Guard because they're rewriting the IMH right now. Randy Ashmore told me that they were in the midst of a rewrite and he was doing some section of it. So we might be able to make a change or two or influence the agenda.
That would be great. I'd like
going
to. I'd
forward.
like to have a seat on that team.
Yes, I would love to see you have a seat on that team. So we agree. So we're going to give some opening directions and maybe reiterate those with some closing instructions. It also, for me, is important to stress that this is your opportunity, you Command and General Staff. This is your opportunity to ask questions and get clarification on the meaning of these objectives. It always feels to me like if no one has a question, either we did a perfect job of explaining it, which seems unlikely, or they're just moving on to the next thing, especially in drills. Like, yep, we got through the Command and General Staff meeting, now we're going to go do our other thing. But if I hear questions and there's some discussion, I feel like then we're on the right track.
And I think that's a key to the unified command giving those directives, providing those opening directives. We've set a list of objectives for you moving forward for the next operational period. If you have any questions on any of the objectives, please stop us as we're going through. We've decided to do a one-page objective form rather than a 3-page objective form. You'll find that all those items are on this one-page form just to make it a little easier for you to digest and to read through. That's the kind of opening directives we want the unified command to give.
Okay. So we've gotten through this. We've reviewed our critical information reporting. Oh, the other part, and this is really, I guess, something we should have talked about during the objectives meeting podcast, but the difference between priorities and objectives. There's a spot on the 202A that lists response priorities, and I have always found that priorities and objectives at least appear to be redundant. What are your thoughts on the difference between the purpose of response priorities and response objectives?
Well, the priorities actually number. So they number your priorities. So you've got safety as your number one priority, environment is number 2. You've got property number 3 and commerce number 4. Those are usually the 4 go-tos for those priorities. Your objectives, you'll notice, are lettered. So they're not in priority response, although you typically safety is at the very, very top of it. The objectives get a little bit more into the meat and guts. So, you've got control the source of the spill. That's, a priority for both what commerce maybe and for the environment and maybe property. Do you understand what I'm saying? So an objective is more focused on what you want the folks to obtain. And the priorities are just, safety is our number one priority. We've got environment as a priority. And you'll notice it says on your environment, it's maximize protection of environmentally, culturally, and historically sensitive areas. So you've kind of added some things in there besides the environment. Kind of hit or miss. I mean, I think having a separate priority list, I think it's just, I also think it's kind of redundant. It just, and then it makes you scratch your head like, well, does environment include historical and cultural? So it kind of makes me, for me, I'm one of those thinkers. So like I said, it can be, I like to put it down under my command emphasis, and I'll say, communications are important, accountability, safety, and this is how safety is a priority and important. This is what you need to do.
And then the action tracker. You really, come into these events with a pre-populated action tracker. Most of the tasks that are on the action tracker are going to get done or at least get considered for every event we go to. There might be some things that are on the action tracker list that we might scratch off, and there might be some things that need to be added, but we don't start with a blank piece of paper. So the Northwest Area Contingency Plan has some. The template that you often bring isn't exactly the same because you've had, more experiences that have led you to say, you know what, we should put this on here. So how important is it to you to come in with this pre-populated action tracker?
So you remember at the Unified Command Objectives meeting, they're doing the two things. They're setting the objectives and then they're completing that first, or, the open action tracker, or reviewing the open action tracker. So coming in with a pre-populated one allows them to spend less time dreaming and thinking of them. And there are things that they're always going to want. They're going to want a site safety plan. They're always going to want somebody to put the SDS out into the field. And they're always going to want some financial claims unit established. They're going to want maybe a wildlife, branch established. They're going to want, divisions and groups, or they're going to want staging areas. They're going to want the Joint Information Center to do some social media outreach. They're going to want them to put together, a notice to the folks out in the field that should you be approached, this is what you do. So those to-do lists are always going to be coming up, whether it's an exercise or whether it's a real response. So having that pre-populated open action tracker allows you to kind of quickly move through. And then if Unified Command has some other lists, things that they want to put on that to-do list, then they can just add those, and every single time you do an exercise, there's usually some that get added, some that get taken away, depending on what the response is, so it will be on there and you're like, yep, this response doesn't require that. Well, that one's easy to delete off, just knowing this is not rocket science. We've done this forever. I call it a cookbook. So, you should come in just like you have your incident management handbook with the agendas and, your roles and responsibilities and everything else. That's a cookbook. Your contingency plans or cookbook. You should have draft forms coming in as a cookbook as well. And, sometimes you change the recipe. Sometimes you move things around. But the goal is to have the cake baked to this standard. That's, so having the things pre-populated, I think coming without those shows that you're not prepared. And in this day and age, we need to be prepared.
Well, do you have any final comments or lessons learned, best practices that you want to share about the Command and General Staff meeting before we wrap up today?
It really truly is the Unified Command's opportunity to give direction to staff. And, it's also then conversely the time for the staff can give updates to the Unified Command. So if the Unified Command has a question about something specific to your section, then they'll ask you a question. So there's a time for a roundtable discussion. Not only is there an exchange of information during both the objectives portion of the Command and General Staff meeting, as well as the open action tracker phase of the agenda, where, if you're in safety, there'll be 3 or 4 items that Unified Command wants you to accomplish. And as the safety officer, you're actually updating the Unified Command on where you're at with those 3 or 4 items. And then they can ask you some questions. But then at the end, I always like to do a quick round robin. Any more updates or questions for the Unified Command? And I'll go through all the officers and chiefs, and then I'll close the meeting with the Unified Command, not just Unified Command, do you have any more closing comments? But Unified Command, do you have any more updates or do you have any additional questions for any of the staff? And that gives them the opportunity to exchange information. Because remember, they're not with you sitting in your section. The Unified Command isn't. But they want a lot of information because they're being asked a lot of questions, not only from up above, but from, the media and the stakeholders, and everybody wants to know what's going on. And the Unified Command is the face of the response. So the Command and General Staff is really that meeting to give them the information and the tools that they need to go out and be the face of the response.
Great. Well, thank you, Cheryl Surface. I guess we'll talk again when we talk about the prep for tactics meeting work period on the next episode.
Looking forward to it, Dan.